And don't go anywhere because we are going to continue. I'm going to stay right here with all of you and invite to the stage our next panelists for our next session. Sarita Gupta, who is a vice president of U.S. programs at the Ford Foundation, and Mustafa Qadri, who is the founder and CEO of Equidem. Please have a seat here. There you go, Sarita. Thank you. Thank you. So I'll just tell you my little vignette. I've got the experts who are going to tell me the truth. But I was at a conference recently, and I spoke to a professor in India. He's based in North India. And we were talking about the climate. And he said, I actually had this interesting experience. We were noticing negative health effects for women higher than for men among agricultural workers. And we sort of thought, well, why is that? And we thought, well, we know the area is getting hotter. Temperatures are rising, but you can always just drink more water. And that we talked to the men and they said, we're drinking more water. And he said, it took us a while, and I'm ashamed to say, but once we finally went and spoke to the women, we found, well, actually they were purposely not drinking more water because they didn't have safe access to a toilet. And so that was the first time that my eyes were open to this issue. And then I got to know what you're doing at Forge, which is a collaboration of philanthropies that are working on really elevating this issue of women, their labor, especially migrant women, and how the climate is changing and scrambling this dynamic in a way that I think is hopefully raising attention for all of us. And we're thrilled at Devex to be partnering with you. We've got this Women Rising series of content that you should see. So tell us sort of what was the impetus behind Forge, behind this work. What's the issue that's happening out there in the world today that you're trying to raise awareness for?
I love that story that you just gave, and we're thrilled to be in partnership with Devex on this series. But that story is exactly what we're trying to address and raise awareness of, that there are very vulnerable workers who are being impacted by climate crisis, and you overlay that with gender-based violence and harassment. So I do want to just take a minute to talk about that, because that's part of what we're trying to lift up here, is that for generations, women have carried the very heavy burden of gender-based violence and harassment in the world of work around the globe. And from garment workers to flower fields, we hear stories that really relay a very painful truth about how inequality and injustice are woven into the fabric of our economies. And so for years, women workers have, without any kind of meaningful domestic legislation protecting women workers, and without any international covenants that are protecting women workers, they began to campaign alongside trade unionists, alongside human rights leaders, to really secure and manifest the kinds of protections that they needed, which resulted actually in this landmark ILO Convention 190, which recognized for the first time in an international instrument the right to a world of work free of violence and harassment. And the reason that is so important to name is because this is the 5th anniversary. Actually, this is the 5th year. It's the 5th anniversary of Convention 190. And what we're realizing is as much progress that has been made, which there has been tremendous around the world, we know that the threat of climate crisis actually threatens this progress. So we can talk more about that.
Yeah, well, I'd love to get Mustafa in the discussion because this is something you studied a lot as a human rights scholar, researcher, as an author, and a journalist. And I was particularly interested in your work around the World Cup in Qatar. And, we remember, I think many of us, all the stories of migrant workers there building, all of the facilities needed for a global event like that, and the conditions, the heat. What does it mean to be a worker today under a changing climate, and how important are these kind of new way of thinking about the world of work? How important is it?
Yeah, absolutely. Firstly, thank you so much for this panel. It's such a key issue to talk about. The key thing to mention is that climate is obviously changing our planet. As Sarita said, workers are really at the front line of that, particularly low-wage, at-risk workers. You mentioned Qatar. In our work, we found obviously workers building the stadiums were not only deprived from access to water, they deliberately give them buckets of ice because they were worried about them taking too many toilet breaks. but that also the women workers in Bangladesh who were making the garments as merchandise for that tournament were actually facing heat stress in the factories. And so, in fact, because our organization is quite unique, we are a human rights research organization, but all our research is done by workers and former survivors of modern slavery. That forces us to listen to what they're personally facing in places like the Gulf, in South Asia and Africa. And so it's not just something that, we're worried about this issue, let's get involved in it, but workers are themselves talking about how they're experiencing it. And also, really critically, it's actually impacting value, it's impacting the economy. And yet, because workers don't have a voice in developing policy, in discussing with enterprises and states on how to address it, it means, in fact, their interventions that could actually help their lives and improve the economy are being lost in that process.
And a lot of these are informal workers, right? How does that impact this? Because, of course, you think about the International Labor Organization, ILO, you think of the trade union movements around the world arguing for better conditions. But in many cases, these are informal workers, maybe even street vendors, right? How do you involve them in this kind of conversation? What do you think can be done from a policy standpoint to support them?
Yeah, it's great. I'm so glad you raised that, because it is about some of the most vulnerable workers are informal workers. So think manual laborers, street vendors, domestic workers, waste pickers, and migrant laborers that are really at the forefront of this and lack often the kinds of labor and social protections that are needed. And so it's really, really critical that they are at the table helping to design the policies on the front end. And that it's also critical that climate change policy is inclusive of this issue of gender-based violence and harassment in the world of work, that these intersections need to come together so workers can be putting the solutions forward in a meaningful way. And I just want to build on something Mustafa said, which is, according to the World Bank, I just want to read this stat to you all. It estimates that climate-induced migration will force 140 million people across sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America to move. And we know that migration exposes women to GBVH, including human trafficking, forced labor, sexual assault, and along the migration route. So this is why it is really critical that we actually bring policy solutions forward, and that workers, whether it's through unions or through organizations like we've seen happen, actually are at the table developing these policies.
And Mustafa, what are some of the kinds of policy solutions you're hearing from workers themselves that they would like to see?
Yeah, and it's a really key question. I mean, so a lot of it, interestingly, I want to stress this, is there are solutions to these things that are, if not off the shelf, actually can be delivered. So much of it is around occupational safety and health. So that means, for example, existing ISO standards, making sure, for example, that if they're working in the field, say agriculture workers, or they're in factories, during the hottest periods of the day, there are rest periods, there's adequate, ventilation and cooling. Often in factories, the product has that cooling technology, the workers don't have it. The other thing, though, and to build on what Sarita said, is, it's forms of representation. And that might be organizing in certain contexts. In other contexts where the workers are informal, it's using other methods. But what you find then is that because you're dealing with not just dozens or hundreds of workers, but thousands, if not millions, on a practical level, you need to be doing that, because it's not enough just on the enterprise level or one-to-one to address it. And so what workers are talking about when you have those conversations is thinking about, for each different context, are there ways, for example, having different types of shifts? If workers work later shifts or in nighttime when it's cooler, making sure that they have more time of rest. Of course, we're talking about mostly women workers.
Right, so there's safety issues if they're going to be working later at night.
And their mothers as well. So making sure that that social protection is also available. I should just very quickly say, sorry for the shameless plug, but we have a new briefing out. And it is very brief, hence the name. But one thing that we've tried to do is not just talk about the problems of climate change and gender in the workplace, but also the solutions. And I want to really emphasize that there are things that we can do that will be good for the economy, but critically can actually save lives, can change lives. That's the key thing.
Yeah, and it sounds like part of it, even for consumers, I'm sure there's a lot of people who wouldn't want to know that they purchased a product that was kept cool, but the worker who made it wasn't, right? And these are the kind of things, the more you can add transparency to that process, the more likely you are to get change. Maybe, Sarita, we can end on just kind of a big picture point, which is, you felt the need at the Ford Foundation and other foundations to come together and to create this coalition because we're at a certain moment in the global economy, right? Things are shifting. Well, what is that shift that you see that means that you, the foundations who are part of this, but all of us in this community need to sort of rise up and pay more attention?
Yeah, I mean, I think a few shifts I would lift up. 6 out of 10 workers worldwide work in the informal economy. So let's be clear about that. 6 out of 10, which means many of them are working in conditions where they don't have labor or social protection. So that's one. The second dynamic I would lift up is the importance of ensuring, again, that workers have voice, that there's worker power is essential in this process. And in fact, I just want to cite, there's this great report that just came out yesterday by the Solidarity Center that actually shows, going to the garment sector in Cambodia, that union versus non-unionized workplaces, there was a huge difference in terms of workers who were experiencing heat-induced stress and fainting. There was actually a horrible case where there were over 360 workers at a garment factory in Cambodia who had fainted over a course of 3 days. So just to make it real for people. So those are the kinds of dynamics that we're talking about. So when you do that, you bring that together with everything Mustafa said about the reality of climate change. We felt as funders that it was important to break our silos as funders, that we need feminist funders, labor funders, climate funders to actually come together and collaborate. And in fact, at Forge, we actually have created a collaboration. We have a fund that we just launched that we would invite many funders to come join us to actually address this intersection of climate change and gender-based violence and harassment. And it just, again, this interconnectedness of climate change, gender-based work, and labor rights is really a critical part of the puzzle of solutions.
I think so too. And like I said, it's something that's got newly aware for me. And I think for this community, it's an important lens on a number of other trends we're familiar with, but this is a really important way to look at it. So we're all going to read Mustafa's report.
Yes.
We're all going to visit the Women Rising website and check out some of the great stories and content, which really brings a lot of this to life. And thank you for bringing this to our state.
And if you're a funder, definitely join the Democracy at Work Fund. So thank you.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking Sarita Gupta, Mustafa Qadri. Thank you.